Well, we continue with the broadcast this morning right here on Salam Media, and we are now going to be talking about Gabon, the elections that had basically turned into a coup with the army takeover. Now, we've seen Gabon, and this is now a country that has been ruled by for 56 years by a father and son, where previously it was Umar Bongo who was the president of Gabon from 1967 right until 2009. And subsequent to that, his son had then followed him, Ali Bongo, and he's been around from 2009 right until now. And he had announced the results of the election, and immediately thereafter, the military ousted him from the presidency in a coup d'etat. And just to understand what is actually playing out, and is this an African problem? Where we've seen in the past, we've seen certain leaders, Robert Mugabe, for instance, in power for a very, very long time. And just to unpack and to analyze some of this and to put this discussion into perspective, we are joined by Gwinyai Taruvinga, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at Wits University, also research on democracy in Africa, the political economy Africa, and the governance of natural resources in Africa. Gwinyai, good morning to you and welcome to the show.
Good morning, Inayet. Thank you for always hosting me.
Yes, now wonderful you're able to join us. And it's always good getting your views and your analysis and your unpacking of what takes place on the African continent in particular. Just your thoughts on what is playing out in Gabon.
So I think I liked how you sort of framed your introduction to say that this is indeed an African challenge concerning democracy and also concerning elections that are highly contested and where the opposition always feels that the elections haven't presented the will of the people. So what we're seeing in Gabon is similar to also what we saw recently also in Zimbabwe a few days ago, where the opposition has also said that the election that the country held was undemocratic. They basically labeled it a sham. When we link it to Gabon, it's also a major crisis we're seeing in that part of Africa, so mainly West Africa, whereby I think this would be the eighth military coup in that particular region. If we look at countries like Chad, and we look at countries like Mali, and we look at countries like Burkina Faso, we're constantly seeing a challenge of democracy, so democratic reversals, but more importantly, we're seeing a scenario whereby leaders who stay long in power, such as Ali Bongo, who is part of a family dynasty in Gabon, are being now replaced by military coups, and these military coups are, receiving the backing of the populace. So if you're looking at what's currently happening in Gabon, it sort of represents a major crisis when it comes to governance on the African continent.
Yes, and also, looking at Africa, and we've come from an ugly colonial past, and to have leaders that want to stay in power forever and ever. Now, this clearly is problematic, Gwinyai.
Yes, it's definitely a problematic issue. So I think this is one of the reasons why we're seeing several military coups occurring. Both the influences of former colonial powers like France, but also leaders who stayed for a very long time. So if you're looking currently again at what's happening in Gabon, a lot of the rumors that are now circling are that leaders such as Paul Biya and Kano in trouble because a lot of what's happening on social media, especially the youth who are unemployed, who are affected by these leaders who are saying for a long time, are sort of now voicing their opinions on social media, sort of targeting and saying that these leaders were saying for a very long time are in danger of being removed by military coups. So it is indeed, an African challenge that can be traced back to our colonial past, whereby the institutions that were inherited by many post-colonial states still represent that idea of holding on to power through any means necessary. And we're seeing this being challenged.
Yes, but also, when one looks at the influence that the former colonizers have on these countries, on leadership in particular, and targeting certain individuals, certain political figures, because in many a case we found that all of this works out to the benefit and in the interest of the former colonizers. So it suits them sometimes to have people like Ali Bongo and I suppose in many other African countries in power.
Yes, so most certain. So you find that I think Ali Bongo enjoyed a very interesting relationship with the former colony in Gabon, and you can also see some of the videos that have been posted on social media that he had a vast amount of wealth that was outside the country as well, which speaks to this relationship that you're talking about. But in terms of the former colonies, I think this is one of the key issues that we need to take into consideration when understanding military coups on the African continent. So if you take, for example, a country like Mali, you'll find that the French were instrumental in the creation of that country's army. And you'll find that that influence is something that is still exercised to a certain extent presently. And we can also see that that continual influence of the former colony still has an impact on the present day events. Hence, we continue to see these military coups happening because many would also actually argue to say that some of these military coups are as a result of the former colonies still trying to flex this power, still trying to use particular leaders to ensure that they still have access to natural resources, they still have access to the funds that former colonies still present to them.
Well, an interesting observation that you make, Gwinyai, because, when we talk about Africa, sometimes we think of African Africans. But you're speaking about the support for the military. Egypt is also part of Africa. And, sometimes we actually ignore the fact and look at the impact and the influence of the United States, for instance, on the military in Egypt in a particular. And we know what is playing out in Egypt with the military coup that obviously Sisi had basically taken over from Mohammed Morsi at that point in time.
Yes, so these are some of the dynamics I think that you rightfully mentioned it. So to say, for example, countries like Egypt, as you've mentioned, and then countries in West Africa that we continue to talk about, really allow us to put this into perspective. And that perspective is that these are some of the events that are playing out within the global community. So, for example, if you take Gabon, the current coup that we are sort of trying to understand, you will see that Gabon is a very resource-rich country, and you find that the proceeds from selling natural resources are only benefiting Ali Bongo and those who are close to him, and which speaks again to a global community that continues to pillage the African continent for natural resources. So that global perspective, which extends again to countries like Mali, countries like Egypt, as you mentioned, allows us to understand that although we are having military coups within the African context, it's part of a broader picture that we're seeing from a global perspective.
Well, definitely. And I suppose, when we talk about military coups, we see them occurring more on the African continent than any other continent around the world.
Yes, most certainly. And I think it goes back to the broader governance challenges that we've spoken about. So I think at the beginning of this interview, you mentioned that we're seeing that on the African continent, there are leaders who've obviously stayed for a very long time. I think you mentioned Robert Mugabe, he also was in power for a very long time. The army was instrumental in removing him. We're seeing this again currently in Gabon, where again the army was instrumental in removing a leader who stayed for too long. So it speaks again to these challenges that we're seeing, whereby especially with how they affect the youth, where the youth obviously looking for employment, they're looking for opportunities after obtaining degrees, but none of these opportunities are available. But you have leaders who are leading resource-rich countries, and these riches are actually not translating into wealth for the country. They're not translating into opportunities for the country. Hence, you find then the military now then finds this gap which they then manipulate, and then we see several military coups happening with the support of the local population because of the desperation that we're seeing from governance challenges on the continent.
Yes. Now, also, I'd like your thoughts, Gwinyai, on the capacity within the army, within the military, like, for example, in Gabon, to actually govern, to deal with the situation. Because we've seen what the army has been saying in Gabon, that they are defending peace by putting an end to the current regime. But again, the capacity to govern, would the army have that capacity?
So look, I think this has been one of the questions and one of the actual challenges that we're seeing concerning military coups on the African continent, whereby the military comes in and they give us a long list of grievances concerning the actual government, and we find that the army, at least in theory, is able to present a front that says, look, These are the issues we're going to challenge, we're going to address rather. And we see that in many cases that doesn't happen. So there's often a saying within African politics that says a coup begets another coup, arguing that in many cases when we have one military coup, it leads to another military coup. And this causes an ongoing crisis of governance on the continent. So essentially what I'm basically trying to get to is to say that in many cases a simple military coup does not actually then translate into addressing the challenges that these African countries are facing, or many African countries are facing. But rather, what's needed is more of dialogue, especially between political leaders and citizens, to then bridge that gap, which normally grows when political parties or political leaders fail to deliver the needs that the citizens want. So ideally, yes, a military coup will stop a leader who's been in power for a very long time. But in many cases, we think that military coups don't then actually go to address the challenges that a country will be facing. Hence, we continue to see a perpetual cycle of military coups continually happening. So what we then need to do again, like I said, is there has to be a process whereby there's dialogue between citizens and political leaders to then bridge that gap, which many militaries try to abuse through military coups.
In fact, you've just basically preempted my next question, and because I was going to be talking about this relationship that the military or the army would enjoy with people on the ground, with citizens, because again, the support of the people is absolutely important, is critical. But again, on the other side, the army needs to be convincing, and it's got to be to the benefit of the people as well, because this is exactly what they want.
Yes, most certainly. So I think in politics, we often talk about a social contract, and a social contract is essentially an unwritten agreement between the citizens and the government to say that the government will provide certain necessities for the citizens. And if that gap between the citizens and the government grows, then we then have a government deficit, which allows, in many cases, military coups to then occur. So what we then need, which is obviously a shift away from military coups, is more of a governance structure that is more inclusive of citizens. Because what we've often found is that citizens support military coups, but afterwards we see that the citizens don't actually then get, the desires that they're looking for, which are obviously maybe economic improvement and job opportunities. So what we need is an approach that is more inclusive, because the reason why we find that many military coups are occurring is that the citizens in many cases are sidelined and they're marginalized, which mainly speaks to the collapse of the social contract. And in many countries, what we need is, the restoring of a social contract, the restoring of the faith between the citizenry and its government. And once that is addressed, we'll find that the challenges that lead to coups are often then addressed because your government is essentially working towards serving the needs of the people.
Yes, but also at the same time, one cannot rule out the former colonizers, because in this case of Gabon, we've seen that what France has said, that they are seizing all operations, in the country. Now they've still got vested interest in the country, whether it's in mining or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, when the going gets tough, then we see statements like these come. And again, when one looks at these colonizers, obviously placing their flags to the mast and showing exactly where their loyalties have been lying all the time.
Yes, most certainly. And I think in many of the interviews that we've had together concerning the African continent, we've often gone back to understanding how the colonial powers still have this massive impact. And we've mentioned this with Gabon, as you've rightfully said, but we also saw this with the recent military coup in Niger, where the leaders of the coup were also in stark contrast to what France was saying, whereby the French were saying that we need to go back to civilian rule, but the army felt that France had for so long continued to pillage the natural resources in Niger. And this is something that we continue to also see with the Gabon case, whereby many argue to say that the president, Ali Bongo in Gabon, had a vast amount of wealth, and many of this wealth was kept in accounts overseas, and many of his wealth was also seen in places like France. So when we also go back to a country like Cameroon with Paul Biya at the moment, many argue to say that he spends most of his time outside Cameroon, but he spends most of his time in France, which again shows you that there's still this ongoing relationship between these leaders who stay in power for a very long time with their former colonial, I don't want to say colonial masters, but their former colonial powers, where we see that again, the French still continue to play this particular role, especially in West Africa. And this is something that I think we can directly link to these military coups because the French, in many cases, are flexing their power. But once they see that something is about to upset that particular balance that they enjoy, they then issue those particular statements as the one you're mentioning.
Yes, and just finally, Gwinyai, just looking at it from an African perspective, and also Gabon in particular. I mean, how do we actually get this colonial monkey off our back? I mean, because this is baggage that we've been carrying for a long time, and it's baggage that it's heavy. It's a very heavy baggage to basically carry. It's become a burden. And how do you get all of this off our back? And I mean, so that Africa as a continent can actually move forward.
I think the strength of the African continent has always lied in its bodies. So bodies like ECOWAS, and then in Southern Africa, bodies like SADC. What we need is our bodies within our regional bodies, especially in our African regions, to be strong enough to speak out against demagogues, to be strong enough to speak against leaders who've stayed in power for too long, and also to be strong, especially against leaders who abuse electoral systems to stay in power for too long. So the strength of our continent lies in these regional bodies. We've often spoken about, Pan-Africanism. We've often spoken about how our African continent needs to shift towards a more unified approach. And that's the only way we can address these challenges that we face. Because one of the things colonialism did to the African continent was to introduce these particular divisions amongst ourselves. And it's now important for us to unify, at least based on our regional bodies such as SADC and ECOWAS. And this is the only way we can address what we refer to as colonial, which is burden on our back. So if we can have our regional bodies strong, we'll be able to move forward.
Well, Gwinyai, I must say, an absolute pleasure is always engaging with you. And we thank you for your time. We do appreciate you taking time out and talking to us right here on Salam Media this morning.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Gwinyai Taruvinga with us this morning once again against the background of the coup in Gabon. And as always, fantastic, I must say, wonderful analysis and unpacking of the situation. We're going to go for a break. We come back, and this disaster in Johannesburg, where we've seen fatalities, numbers right up to 63, the Marshalltown fire, up next.